All right, so welcome to the video. So I wanted to talk about this number representations. So you see basically four different numbers, or it seems that they're different, at least they're written differently. And what I hope that every student coming out of basically grade 8 is comfortable in going back and forth between these different representations. So all of these four numbers that you see, they're actually identical. They're exactly the same thing. And what you should know is how to go back and forth in between. So if somebody gives you, say, a decimal number, you can very easily convert it to a fraction or a mixed number. If somebody gives you a percent, you can change it back to a decimal or change it back to a fraction. Now, when you're working with these numbers, why do you really care, right? So sometimes students, all they really want to do is, okay, let me just solve these questions. But the beauty is that you use different representations for different things in various different situations. So obviously we use decimals quite a bit. So decimals are really just base 10 numbers. And those particular decimals you kind of grow up with, you're using them all along. But as you're departing into, kind of going into high school, I hope personally, although I don't teach high school, I teach in the post-secondary, I hope that all students know how to work with all the different representations very easily. So if you're in sciences, for example, so the number that you see there at the bottom is scientific notation, and you can go back and forth between decimals as you please. If you are, for example, going into business, not even business, in everyday life, you should be very comfortable with percents, which really is just a scaling of 100. And one of the things that students really dislike for whatever reason, I'm not sure, something happens along the way, okay, in the early grades, fractions. So you should be very comfortable with fractions. And going back and forth between representations is actually one test that I like to do, asking students, can you convert between these different four representations? So these representations and the numbers that you have just seen, they're all equivalent, they're all the same. So here is kind of the representations given as in these little bubbles, right? So you would see decimals, then you see there at the bottom scientific notation, you see percent on the left, and then fractions and mixed numbers. Now, these are the four different types of representations which I would want all students to know how to do. Now, in this video, so I'll take an example and I'll show you how to convert between one and the other, but you do need a little bit of background. So I am assuming, okay, so for instance, before you watch this, I am going to link in the show notes, and then maybe I'll put a little card up above, okay, how to go back and forth, for example, between decimals and scientific notation. So how to go back and forth in between scientific notation, back to decimal, decimal to scientific notation. That you should know how to do very well. All right, so I'll put that in the show notes. The other thing is I'll do another link, which is a video that I have done, and that is the video which basically goes between percent, decimals, and fractions and mixed numbers. So I'll show in the link, okay, how to go in between all of those. And when you group those together, you can combine them all, and then you can comfortably be able to solve back and forth between the different representations that you're dealing with here. So for instance, what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is if you have this particular example, so 0.075, so it's a decimal. So you should be able to identify first that it is a decimal. And now let's say that I would ask you, okay, please convert it back into any of these formats, either percent, scientific notation, or a fraction. Let's do all of them. All right. So if you would watch those videos on scientific notation and decimals, so you would be able to convert this decimal into a scientific notation. Now, scientific notation composes of two things. It has a mantissa, which is basically a leading number, and then it is multiplying by a base 10, by a power of 10. So in here, so the answer to this example is actually 7.5. times 10 to the negative 2. Now, where did that come from? So as I said, you can watch the video for many examples, but where it has come from, kind of in short, is that whenever we're converting a decimal, right, and we want to be able to convert it to scientific notation, we are multiplying or dividing by powers of 10. So in this case, notice if you switch the decimal 2 over, then you're going to get your 7.5. So that is your mantissa. Now, because you moved it over by 2, okay, so you made this number, that is where this negative 2 has come from. All right, so that's where that negative 2 is coming from, because we shifted the decimal over. And that would be a conversion between a decimal and a scientific notation number. All right, so that's what we have there. Now, once we have that, we can, of course, change it back to a percent, or we can change it back to a fraction or a mixed number. So in this case, it would be a fraction. So for a percent, so if I take my decimal, and now I want to change it back into a percent. So percent is basically scaling of 100. And since we're going from a decimal to a percent, we're just simply multiplying by 100. So this would turn out to be 7.5. And we put the percent symbol to let the user know what that would be. So that's what we have there. All right. So that is scaling back to a percent. And now, lastly, okay, if we wanted to change it back into a fraction, well, for a fraction, so since this is a decimal 0.075, so this again, so it's just powers of 10. So this is the 10th place, 100th place, and the 1000th place. So what we have is, okay, so you just simply take your 75, so that's right there. Yeah, that's unexpected. Look at that. Because I'm talking, so the cat comes back, okay, to try to help me out with some maths. It's like, are you okay? You're talking to yourself. All right, okay. Get it off. Okay, so coming back to math. So we have, okay, so that's the 75. So that comes up from the decimal. And then because we're converting it back, okay, we're going to be dividing by 1,000 because it is the 1000th place value. So, right, tenths, hundredths, thousandths. All right. And now, of course, you can reduce this. So I can reduce this, and that is knowing a little bit of fractions, of course. And for that, in terms of reduction, so 75, so actually 25 will go into that 3 times. And then you can put 25 into 1,000. Okay, and that would be 40. And you can do that. And what I always expect out of students is that they can do this without calculators. And that is a skill. It's a skill to be able to create in your mind this idea of how you're going to be able to solve these types of questions. So this is what I mean by number representations. It is being capable of switching at any point in time back and forth between various types of problems like this. Okay, now let's take a look. So I'll give you another one. Okay, so this one sometimes will come up, and then I notice that students might get stuck on something like this. So let's say you're given a percent value. Now, when you're looking at this, so people think that this is some kind of a fraction, right? But it is a percent. It has a percent symbol. So now let's convert this percent. And again, we're going to be converting it back to all the other representations. You should be able to do that. So we have 2 1/3 of a percent. Now, don't forget that this means 2 and, which means plus, 1/3 of a percent. So we'll worry about the percent after. Now, if I wanted to convert this to a decimal, so this really is, well, 2 is 2. The end, so that's your decimal mark. And this right here, so this 1/3 that you're carrying, okay, so that is 0.333333 and so on. So that we can represent by a 3. And what we can do is, okay, so since it is repeating there, okay, so that 3 repeats. So this is 2.3 and so on, but it's still a percent. So now we still have to divide by 100 to scale it down back into a decimal. So if you're going to be scaling it down and dividing by 100, so the decimal place just shifts over by 2, and what you have is you have something like this. And not many people can do that for whatever reason. And that's what I mean by being comfortable with these representations. They mean the same thing. 2 1/3% is 0.023 bar, which is the repeating, just a decimal. Now, what if you wanted to write this in scientific notation? Well, now that we already have the decimal, then writing this in scientific notation is not really a big deal. So just like in the previous example, so this would be 2.3 bar times 10 to the minus 2. So notice what I did was we're shifting over by 2 decimal spots. And I encourage you to watch those videos on scientific notation's decimal conversions. All right, so that is, now we have a percent, we have a decimal, we have scientific notation. And now what about a fraction or a mixed number? Okay, so how do we do that? So we know, so what we have is, okay, so this is the last one. So we have 2 1/3%. And now we want to change it back into a fraction or a mixed number. So what we have is, so from here, we can do one of two things. We can simply break it down as we did right here on top. So 2 1/3. So we know what that would be. Or we can just create an improper fraction right away. So notice 3 times 2 plus 1. So that's 7/3. That's what this would be as an improper fraction. Now, because we have this percent symbol, what we need is we need to divide by 100 to change it back. So what we have is 7/3 divided by 100, which is the same thing as multiplication by the reciprocal. So this is what we have. The 7 can't really be reduced. It's a prime number. So this becomes that. And you're done. And that is actually the equivalent as a fraction. So you have two examples and I've changed them back. In the show notes, I'm going to link. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just link, okay, so the following handout so that anybody can try these and test yourself on it. Leaving grade 8, you should be able to know how to do this. Comfortably go back and forth between the 4 different representations kind of for base 10. That's what you should be able to do.